Well, good morning. This is Bill Boerum, and good afternoon to Emily Conrad, who is on the East Coast of the United States. And I'm very happy to have some of her time today to talk about the Faithless, question mark, the story of the Electoral College. And just as we were about to start, I was saying to Emily that I had been very busy the last few weeks for several reasons, one of which I was doing lectures to international audiences about the US presidential campaign, and also in Russia, India, Nepal, and various other countries, which were quite interesting to do that and get their reactions, lecture, then Q&A. And part of this story that I would tell about the US presidential campaign going on for almost 18 months, depending on when you start counting, was one of the most intriguing elements was the Electoral College and what can happen with the electors. And Emily and I have been in touch a little bit about the electors and who some of them are. But of course, today, November the 17th, matters seem to be in hand as to determining who will be voted for in the two parties. But anyway, welcome to Emily. And if I may ask, what drew you to the topic of the Electoral College?
Well, what drew me to the topic was actually my own, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but I'll just go ahead and just use it, my own ignorance about the institution. So I was in the process of writing a paper for grad school, and I was told I needed to add some footnotes and that sort of thing to one of my papers. And I had been talking about U.S. elections, and I knew I needed to have some supporting materials about the Electoral College. And whenever I was doing my research, I came across one single sentence that said that there were these faithless electors in the 2016 election. And for me, that was absolutely fascinating because first of all, I was thinking to myself, what are faithless electors? I had never heard of the term faithless elector before. And then secondly, whenever I was going into this, I was extremely interested that in 2016, there were both Democratic and Republican faithless electors. So that really piqued my curiosity and my interest. And so I decided to start researching it. And I began to reach out to as many of the electors, as many of the faithless electors as I could, and just see if they would be willing to share with me their story.
Well, that's a wonderful lead into, and it's certainly a logical one as to what drew you to this particular topic, which seems to surface maybe every 4 years, depending on how close the popular vote is or how close the Electoral College vote is. So, hats off to your intellectual curiosity. And also, and we'll get into the book, but also it's a very human story, which you relate with some wonderful writing in the book. It's not just a stale political government type of thing. It's a very human story, I think. But just as we start, let me ask you about the title of the book, which I found intriguing. Sometimes an artist of a painting, the admirers see more than the artist intended. So I'll ask you about the title. Your title is in this book, The Faithless, question mark. So what
Yeah.
does that mean to you, Emily?
Well, when I first realized that I had a book on my hands, I always envisioned the title as The Faithless, no question mark. I knew it was a bit sensationalistic, but I thought that that would do well for the subject matter. But as I really talked with the electors, and they began, and I would ask them, I mean, I developed relationships with almost every single interviewee. And I would call them up one week and we might wait a couple of weeks, I'd call them up again. As I really interviewed these individuals, and I asked them, do you consider yourself a faithless elector, or what do you think of that term faithless elector? It became clear that none of them thought of themselves as faithless. And for me, that was extremely interesting. And I realized that these people had basically given me a gift of sharing their stories with me and allowing me to tell their stories. And I didn't want to put a title which they would disagree with on the cover of the book. So I wanted to pose a question to basically the readers, because the faithless is such a derogatory term, and we throw it around, faithless electors. For the people talking about the Electoral College, this term is thrown out without much thought into what that actually means. And I wanted people to really think it through, because these individuals I interviewed, they didn't view themselves as they viewed themselves as the protagonists of their own story. They didn't view themselves as faithless individuals who are bad people. And so I wanted people to really think through that topic, and at the same time think through, what is this electoral college that we have, and what role do these electors play, and what role should they play in that institution? So yeah, that's kind of how the title came about. I had somebody edit my book, and we were going through a lot of potential titles, and we got like conscientious electors, and we're coming up with all these titles. And then I thought to myself, this is a book about human stories. I don't want to put some academic title to this book. So I just said, okay, The Faithless with a question mark, and then we'll leave it at that and let the reader decide.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that the title was very intentional, and that there was a difference between just saying the faithless, which would be pejorative, really, because you would be saying that they were not faithful to something which had a certain validity to it. And you've raised the question there, as you explained, which recognizes the attitudes of your subjects, and also provocative for the readers.
Yes, that was my hope.
Well, it worked. Well, I hope you had a lot of sales, and I hope your publisher, who I forget, whoever it is pushing that book now, because during a short window, it can be very thought provoking. But of course, a little bit later in the conversation, we'll get into the legal jeopardy of these electors, which was raised during the course of the book also. If I may ask you a little bit about the mechanics, were you able to meet with any of these electors on a in-person basis?
No, I actually have not met with a single one of the electors in an in-person basis. All of my interviews were done on phone, or phone interviews or video calls.
Right, right. Well, that again, I think is a tribute to you, because in reading the book, which I did about a month ago, it really seemed to me that you got to their personalities. You really had a sense of who they were. And as I recall, there are 7 subjects in the book, and you really made them each stand out differently from each other. So, again, a tribute to you in what you sensed about their personalities, and being able to portray it, in words. So fantastic.
Well, well, each one of the electors each one of them definitely had their own motivations for voting faithlessly, and that's what I wanted to explore. So for me, that's what was so interesting about it, is that one of the reasons that really drew me to this topic, I was wondering what happened, or what happened where you saw people on the Republican side and on the Democratic side decide to vote faithlessly. And because, I mean, to be chosen as an elector, you have to be, your party affiliation has to be an integral part of your identity or your life. And what happened that they were willing to give that up? Because now, as you can see, they're not really involved in party politics anymore. So I really wanted to explore what is happening in our political system and our political environment, where you see these two sides do something that's so dramatically similar. I mean, a very dramatic thing, and it's the same action to vote faithlessly. However, they all got through it through different ways, and they all made that decision through for different reasons. And I really wanted to explore that. So I basically, the first time that I would speak with somebody, I would just say, well, explain to me your background and how you came about your political beliefs. And the first time that we would talk, typically we wouldn't even talk about their faithless vote at all. It's just like, let me understand how you developed your political identity. And so I had very in-depth conversations with almost with all the electors that I interviewed.
Right. Well, that's a very good prelude to a further conversation here. And but let's lay out perhaps with people who aren't familiar with the situation. There were 5 electors in the state of Washington who did not vote for Hillary Clinton, and there were 2 in the state of Texas who did not vote for Donald Trump. Is that correct?
I
Oh, there was
I'm under the
Colorado in the
impression that
picture.
it was 4 in Washington and then 2 in Texas, is if I remember correctly.
Wasn't there also one in Colorado?
There was an attempted vote in Colorado. So
Ah, that's a good point. Right.
so what I say, because this is where it gets a little complicated. People ask how many faithless electors were there. There
Right.
were 7 faithless votes that actually counted in the 2016 election, 5 Democrat and 2 Republican. And then you had 3 faithless votes that were invalidated and during the vote itself. And those were all Democrats from Minnesota, from Colorado, and from Maine. And then you had 2 individuals that were Republicans who publicly considered a faithless vote, received a lot of the lobbying efforts to change to impact their vote, and then they both ended up stepping down. So I say that there are kind of 12 faithless narratives in 2016, but only 7 of these votes actually counted.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that stepping down or resigning or whatever, being pushed out, is a part of this story as well, which continues to this day. It has implications for this year,
Yes.
no doubt about it. So, um, well, let's go back to the people in Washington State, because as you say, there were 4 of those who voted for Colin Powell. Who did the 4 in Washington State actually vote for in the Electoral College?
So in 2016, you saw 3 votes for Colin Powell for president and 1 vote for Faith Spotted Eagle.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, and of the 3 for Colin Powell, those were all affiliated with the Hamilton electors. I interviewed 2 of them for my book. One of them was a co-founder of the Hamilton electors movement, which was an attempt to get moderate Republicans to change their vote from Donald Trump to another candidate, and by also convincing Democratic electors to vote for a moderate Republican. So that was a major thing going on, and 2 other Washington electors kind of allied themselves with this individual, Brett Chafello. One of them, Levi Guerra, her narrative, she was a Hamilton elector, but she had a unique narrative of her own, basically, and she's the one who determined Colin Powell being their choice. She was a Democratic elector for kind of a more red area, and she was 18 years old when selected as an elector.
Mm.
Whenever the summer came, she started to realize she was just going around listening to what people were saying, and she thought to herself, maybe, what qualities do people want in a president? And she started to realize that Colin Powell was extremely popular among the demographic of people that would be her constituents. So that was extremely interesting to see.
Right. Well, again, there were a number of different circumstances as you have just outlined. And then each of these people who, I think it's fair to say, examined their own motivations, their own consciences, if we can say that, and what their purpose would be with the designation they had received. Now, how many of them, or if you just want to mention certain states, had signed a document, a so-called pledge? Because this came up in the recent Supreme Court case. Did all of them sign pledges? Because as I read through it, and it became a little hazy as I continued, but some of them were named casually, if you will. Hey, do you want to do this? And other things going on at the convention in a given state or party. And I just wondered if there ever, to your recollection, how many of them, and let's go back to Washington, because that was the case. Did they all sign individual documents pledging to vote for the party nominee? Do you recall?
In the case of Washington, they did. And but unfortunately, there is no uniformity. So it's difficult to say, are electors required to sign pledges? Because there is no uniformity state to state, or even within a state, party to party. So it makes it kind of difficult to kind of say this is how it operates, or this is how the Electoral College operates. I think every single one of my interviewees did indeed sign a pledge. I am unsure whether that was to the party itself or to the state government, or and then another thing is that a lot of these pledges, they don't have enforcement mechanisms. So even if somebody does sign a pledge, I mean, if they break the pledge, there's no enforcement mechanism in especially in the case of 2016.
Right. I think that's a point that's well made. And that was probably why the case began its journey to the Supreme Court, because in effect, the Washington electors, well, we'll call them faithless, they were charged with a fine of $1,000.
Yes. And the reason, and what you started to see was that some states did have binding elector laws of some sort, typically because they had a faithless elector in the past. In the case of Washington State, there was a Republican, I think, state senator, Mike Patton. I think it was in the 70s that, or maybe it was, I think it might have been 76. I'm trying to remember exactly. And he did not vote for his party nominee. So that was so Washington actually put in binding elector laws at that point in time. And their binding elector laws, of course, were not enough to remove an elector after a faithless vote. It was only enough to implement a fine after a faithless vote.
But a penalty, in effect, for not doing what they were expected to do. Right. So, well, I do remember one elector that, at least one, was very worried about the consequences of being faithless, that he'd be charged this fine, and he felt he didn't have the money to pay it, which was interesting. But he was very conscientious, ultimately followed what he felt was his conscience and did vote, but he was worried about the penalty of the fine. And I wonder if after the Supreme Court case, whether he's had to ante up. But anyway, well, I had also read, as a companion book to reading yours, which was so engrossing, was another recent book called "Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?"
Yeah.
And the preface, I forget when that came out, but the preface on that was very, very interesting. And I forget if it was that preface or yours, which talked about the the origins of the Electoral College in the Constitutional Convention. And it seemed to me that certain of your interviewees, these faithless electors, went back to original sources and documents. Is that correct? They went back to the,
They did, and I did not go so much into the Constitutional Convention in my book. Both of the books, I think we kind of delve in more into the 12th Amendment and kind of the
right,
implications of that, but I didn't really, because there have been so many excellent historians that have followed the creation of the Electoral College that I didn't feel the strong need to do that, and I couldn't do it better than they have, just in general. But yes, to answer your question, most all of the electors, most people, even if they disagree with the Electoral College, they find the institution a great responsibility and a great honor. And what's really interesting is that I think after the election in November, almost all of these electors have this, maybe this realization that their vote is actually one of the 538 that count in the country.
mhm,
And you really start to see a lot of self-reflection after that point in time. And so for me, that was very interesting to talk to these individuals about that. Most of them, because most of them went back to Hamilton's Federalist number 68. That is one that many people go back to. But in the case of 2016, you had, for example, a college professor, and he read lots of historical documents. But you had a lot of individuals that really wanted to understand, what is this, and what is this institution that I'm playing a part of, and just understanding the historical context of what their vote means.
right.
Because unfortunately, not many people get chosen as electors, and what I discovered is that they don't exactly understand what a member of the Electoral College is, which is kind of interesting.
Well, again, in some of the, some of your reporting and interviews with these people, they hardly knew what they were getting into, only superficial knowledge, and it was casually entered into. And it was only later that it dawned on them that there was a great responsibility here.
Yes.
One thing that struck me was in reading both books, and I can understand why you needed to limit your scope to the human story and to the relevance of the 2016 election results. That there's a long history. I mean, in the other book I just mentioned, it's very interesting. But then he goes on to a very, very in-depth legislative history of trying to deal with the Electoral College, a very scholarly approach, which
Yeah.
may not appeal to the casual reader. Again, as I say, I think the preface in that book is probably as much as the casual reader may need. But anyway, it's documented. But let me go back to my thought and ask you, it seemed to me that people, several of them who did the historical research, read the Federalist 68, they came to understand the responsibilities as originally conceived for the electors to, that they would be good and virtuous people. That word kind of popped up to me somewhere.
Mhm.
And that they were to select. The whole concept of the Electoral College was that these would be very good people from that state, that community, who would look to the best possible attributes of character and experience for who they would cast their vote for. So they had this burden. So if we could talk a few minutes about the original concept of electors, and then what came to be starting in 1796, the emphasis on the influence of parties and all of that, which kind of, to me, muddies the waters from the original concept. So what's your understanding of the original intent of the writers and signers to the Constitution?
Well, it's actually quite interesting, and as the other book that you mentioned points out, there was a lot of debate around the Electoral College and how to choose a leader of an executive branch. one of the major challenges was ensuring that such an executive would not be beholden to the legislature, and really having this balance of powers and separation of powers. So that was so that was deeply ingrained in the framers' minds, of course. And you take a look at the political culture that existed when the Electoral College was envisioned. You didn't have political parties at that point in time. And so it was extremely interesting. The electors were definitely, even whenever you take a look at that, there was not even popular vote nationwide at that point in time. And
Right.
that's also important to note. Electors in many states, they could be chosen by popular vote, and or they could be chosen directly by a governor or even a state legislature. The idea was to keep the selection of the president outside of the hands of say, the Senate, and making there to be some level of balance. The original Electoral College, as it was envisioned, I think that everybody knew that George Washington was going to be president. So there really wasn't too much of a contest at that point in time. The contest was who was going to be vice president. And really, when you see, and so the Electoral College worked well whenever it was clear who was going to be president. Really, what you start to see in coming up is that you see the division between the Federalists and the emerging Democratic Republican Party in John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, and they're both extremely popular. And then you have an administration where the two main leaders of the executive branch are kind of at odds with each other throughout the whole time. So looking at it, that is one of the reasons why the 12th Amendment was added. It was specifically to amend the Electoral College and to include the incorporation of and the development of political parties into that Electoral College mechanism.
So that was a reality check as to the politics of the time, but it would seem to me that that was really a big difference from what was originally intended. I mean, again,
Yes, even within the first few years, it was clear that the intention that the intention was not, with the development of political parties, everything changed.
right.
And the Electoral College has been operating, I think, where it's been operating, I guess, well enough under the circumstances, but it's certainly not what the framers of the Constitution envisioned.
Right. Well, do you feel that certain of your interviewees, certain of these faithless electors, that they kind of hearkened back to the original intent?
Well, I think that each one of them had a different feeling for it. You had and you can't really separate their votes from the politics that was occurring within their own parties.
Right.
And that's
Ah,
one of the things that I feel like if people or people and somebody said that one of the people I got blurbs from said it's a good way to understand the era, our political era, or something along those lines. Because what you start to realize, at least one of the things that I realized right away, is that every single Democratic elector who voted faithlessly in 2016 were originally Bernie Sanders supporters.
right.
So you see that, and then you also saw in 2016 you had just a massive amount of Republican candidates trying to win the primary. Trump was, of course, the winner, but when some of the electors were chosen, it wasn't so sure if Trump would even be the nominee at that point in time. So at least what I started to see was that what we saw in 2016 was not just an issue that is facing the Electoral College, but also issues that are facing each one of our major political parties. And as we look forward, I think that's extremely important because as many people and many other scholars have noted, one of the things keeping the two-party system functioning in the United States is indeed the Electoral College. Basically, if you take a look at it, if you remove the Electoral College from the scenario, then it would be very easy for, local politicians, local political figures, or even, radical political figures to gain enough Electoral College votes. Well, not if you remove the Electoral College, but even if you adopt the district congressional method, you could start to see, if you don't have the winner take all system, you would start to see radicalized pockets be able to deny the 270 majority votes necessary to win. So it's really interesting to take a look at the Electoral College, and when people call for abolishing it, I think that both political parties at the end of the day might be slightly skeptical because they realize that it would change the political climate as we know it.
Well, I think what you have just said is a real big takeaway, which I haven't heard voiced or read anywhere, that the Electoral College really supports the political party system that we have today. I think that's a really powerful insight, because if you didn't have the Electoral College, and if you went to just straight national popular vote, you could have the rise of third parties over time. And someone could get, 34% of the vote, and the others getting 33% of the vote, and the 34% candidate could win, and it might not be Republican or Democrat Party. It could be some other
Exactly.
person. So I think that is an incredible insight that you brought to this conversation. So anyway, if we may turn to this recent Supreme Court decision. Have you had a chance to read over that decision?
I've read over most of it. I listened to it as it was argued at the
Oh, you
Supreme
did?
Court.
Yeah.
I did. I tuned in live for that, and then I wrote a postscript talking about the Supreme Court decisions in my book. And because whenever I first interviewed, when I first started interviewing these people, you have to realize there were two Supreme Court cases that were argued, and that was Ciafello versus Washington and Colorado versus Baca. And Ciafello versus Washington, I interviewed Brett Ciafello. And then for Colorado versus Baca, I also interviewed Michael Baca. And Levi Guerra was also involved in that lawsuit. And so when I first started interviewing them, we didn't know where this case was going to land. And I heard a lot of optimism in their voices about what this could mean. And so it was very interesting because it was even COVID hit in the middle of whenever they were supposed to originally argue it. And it got pushed back, and they were even worried that it wasn't going to be decided before the 2020 general election. So that was it was very interesting to be communicating with them. And then right after the results, I tried to get back in contact with all the interviewees that I had talked with to get their understanding of what happened. And I think that there are some gaping holes with the Supreme Court's decision, which makes it so that in 2020, in July, you saw you saw just a lot of these quotes and these sensationalistic headlines. Oh, the Electoral College is fixed. Well, if you really read through the lines, if you understood what the court cases meant, you realized it wasn't fixed. It just actually made it much more complicated. The Electoral College is already a complicated system, and the Supreme Court decisions made it even more so.
Right. It was interesting to me to see that Justice Thomas wanted to write his own concurring opinion of the court. And of course, it was a unanimous decision by the court. So despite allegations and charges of political division, which occur from time to time, it was a unanimous decision. And I have no idea, maybe you do, of exactly how the Chief Justice operates, whether he said, look, okay, we've got some different reasons why we are reaching this decision. So why don't we express them, which is not unusual. But I think Roberts has become characterized to a degree as someone who does not want the court to be part of a political environment. And you wonder if the hand of, would be conjecture, whether the hand of John Roberts was there in encouraging Thomas's concurrent opinion.
Mhm.
Again,
Well, one of the things that was obvious in listening to it, and then also what I've read through with the opinions, is that they were very concerned, and listening to the cases as they were argued, the justices kept on using the word chaos again and again and
oh,
again, and that was something they wanted to avoid electoral chaos. And and for me that was unusual, because what was getting argued wasn't whether or not faithless electors should be allowed. What was being argued was whether or not state laws to bind electors are constitutional. And those are two very different topics. And so I think that when they decided that state laws to bind electors are constitutional, basically what they did was that they threw the responsibility into the hands of state governments. And different state governments, as we know, I
mhm,
mean, different state governments may have different ways that they interpret the or in different ways that they view the Constitution, and especially in different ways that they can manage the Electoral College. So when they decided to that binding elector laws are constitutional, one of the things that became very clear was that only 33 states had binding elector laws. And of those, many of them were just a fine, like in Washington state. Only 14 of those can actually remove a faithless elector after a faithless vote and replace that elector with somebody else. So, so what it does is that it really creates a system where you can have one state and a faithless elector is completely legal. And maybe in the state neighboring it, their faithless vote would be invalidated. And maybe in the state next to it, their faithless vote stands, but they have to pay a fine. Or maybe, like in this case of South Carolina, where I'm from, I did some research on it. Basically, a faithless elector could vote faithlessly, but then they will face criminal charges afterwards. So what's happened now is that what you're starting to see is that all these different states have different binding elector laws, and that there's really not a sense nationwide of the system. So it's made an already complicated system, as I said, is slightly more complicated, because there is no nationwide way where electors are selected, and now there's no nationwide way of determining whether a faithless vote stands or whether it is illegal.
right, right. Well, those are points well made. Do you expect, and this is obviously conjectural, do you expect that there will be any faithless electors uh, when the college meets, so-called, on December the 14th?
I would not be surprised if there were,
Hmm,
the reason for that isn't that, and the reason for that is that faithless electors are a way of really bringing attention to a certain issue. And a lot of the faithless electors that we saw in 2016, they were trying to send messages. Unfortunately, most of their messages kind of got lost in translation. You saw Robert Satayacom, a Native American Peel Up activist, and his message was that, the leadership and the political leadership that we have is lacking. So I'm going to choose somebody who I respect from the Native American community. You take a look, his electoral college votes were the first electoral college votes for Native Americans in the history of the country. I mean, he pioneered a first in that. You saw Levi Guerra, LJ Guerra, basically wanting to address what is it like? Basically, the question that she had, I mean, it is an excellent question. What if you're in a blue state but in a red district, or what if you're from a red district or what if you're from a red state and you live in a blue district? Are you still, if you're going to really represent the people that you want to represent, I mean, do we need to move towards a district method of selecting our electors like Nebraska or Maine? You saw Brett Chafello and Michael Baca, and theirs were really seriously strong anti-Trumpers, never Trumper messages. Then you saw Bill Green out of Texas, and he is strong supporter of Ron Paul and the Liberty Movement. So what you start to and then David Mullinex out of Hawaii, of forever Bernier. So what you start to realize is that all of these electors were sending out messages, and I think that the messages and what they were trying to portray through their power, and as one of the 538 votes count, they were trying to send out messages to the general public. And I think that many other electors in 2020 may choose something similar if presented with the right circumstances.
So those well, that's a very good insight as to the motivations that could project themselves in this year.
Yeah.
Which, of course, it would seem that in the case of the Democratic Party, the people who are supporters of Bernie Sanders, they may have a reason, an immediate political reason to say, hey, we're here and recognize us. Some of those may attempt that message.
Well, and you also might see if basically, if you take a look at Donald Trump, if you have a kind of Republican Party faithfuls who were never that supportive of Trump to begin with, if there's no way that Trump will win, they might choose to kind of vote faithlessly for a candidate that they think might have a good chance in 2024, as a way to kind of bring that person to light within the party mechanism.
Well, that's a very good point. Yeah, I think that's right. I was going to ask you about the Republican side, that obviously that motivation is there with, there being the Lincoln Project and various other moderate Republicans. They don't want to have had Trump capture totally the Republican Party with a Trumpism doctrine or philosophy. So certain of these electors may want to make that statement. And I think you've pointed further to perhaps someone that they would like to give a leg up to, if you will, for the Republican Party in 24. So that's right. Do you anticipate any realistic moves to try to alter the Electoral College in some way? There seems to be from time to time the interest in doing so, but it never gets anywhere.
You mean Electoral College reform?
Yes, right.
I do foresee that because I think that younger people are very skeptical of the Electoral College. That being said, I do not think, just based off of, as I said, the Electoral College being a mechanism that preserves the two parties, the two-party power sharing mechanism, I do not foresee that such a move would be drastic at this point. That's my gut instinct. I might be proven wrong, certainly. Regardless, I think that there may be a lot of movements at the state levels to start bringing changes about to the Electoral College. And I think that such measures might be well received. For example, and this, of course, depends on the individual state. One of the things that I always recognize is that, at least in my home state and on the ballots of many states throughout the country, electors are not on the ballot. So I think that just starting to have mechanisms, and you might have other state laws that say electors must be democratically selected by their political parties. You can have many sort of mechanisms, and I think you'll start to, maybe perhaps state legislatures might start to look at their state laws around the Electoral College, and I think certainly that will happen.
Right.
Whether or not we'll see a successful nationwide movement to have any sort of Electoral College reform. But for me personally, I think that reform is necessary just from a national security standpoint, actually. You take a look, there are 538 votes that actually do matter at the end of the day. And these individuals are constantly lobbied for, every 4 years, you see electors lobby to change their votes. And these electors, well, some of them are party elites, many of them are just active members of their political party and are normal everyday citizens. And if they're faced with the death threats and everything else, I think that is a kind of an unsustainable system at this point in time.
Mhm.
And we need to address certain issues associated with the Electoral College.
Right. Well, of course, it's difficult to find out who the electors are. I had looked into Michigan and also North Carolina and got those lists, and it did take some doing, and that was back in, I think, August or so. You could obviously charge around, maybe as you did, and got the lists of all of the elector candidates, but you've got to go to the Secretary of State's office or elsewhere to see who the parties have put up. But they are they are in effect to the public anonymous who these electors are. We vote for the major party candidates, but we don't realize that their own electors are behind the scenes. So maybe that's a reason for transparency. But I mean, none of the newspapers, to my knowledge, have reporters chasing around for the list of candidates, which to me would be a little bit of a story.
Well, that was I have noticed that some states you just don't even have that, and I was able to find a lot of lists of electors for 2020, and I was surprised by how many governors are on the lists, actually.
Really?
Yes, and how many governors, lieutenant governors, attorney generals, and also party chairmen are on the
Oh,
list,
really?
or party vice chairmen, state party
I'm
chairmen.
surprised that you would say that because I thought the Constitution did not allow elected public officials to be electors.
They do not allow federal
Right,
government
right.
employees or officials to be electors. But states, that actually depends upon the laws of the state. So in some states, they have laws that say that the person cannot be a state office holder. But in most states, they have no such mechanism.
So it's only the federal Constitution that prohibits federal officers from
Yes.
being an elector, right? That's a good point. Well, it certainly seems that in these different states, they wanted to ensure party loyalty, not taking any chances. And I believe that 2016 was a record high number of faithless electoral votes. Is that
It
correct?
was.
Right,
Yes.
right. Well, this has just been very, very fascinating. So many other insights you've given. Now, you mentioned about an addendum or something. Was that in your book? Maybe I missed it. Did you write some follow-up to the book?
It's at the very end. So I actually have a copy of my book right here. It's The Faithless.
Right.
And it's just the postscript at the very end.
Oh, the
So it's
postscript,
just a
right.
little chapter called the postscript after the Supreme Court on page
Okay. Well, this,
267.
I might have gotten an earlier version of the book, um,
You may
which,
have.
yeah, because I didn't notice that. So, well, anyway, let me ask you a tough question here. And well, these have all been interesting questions, I hope. Um, what are your plans for continuing the theme? Uh, are you considering another book on this theme or some other magazine or writing that will update the situation?
I am, certainly. I'm very interested in what happens in 2020 and to see if any stories arise out of that. I'm not sure if there will be at this point, but if there is, I certainly want to be on the ground and covering this, because this is one of the most, unfortunately, it is, I think, one of the least reported and least understood parts of our electoral process. And I think that it's important that we understand what we have. And for me, that's why I focused on the human stories, because focusing on human stories allows us to understand how people made these decisions. And I think it brings the Electoral College to life in a new way. If you read a lot of scholarly pieces about the Electoral College, you think of it as a monolithic organization. And then you lose sight of the fact of, hey, these are 538 people, and with each with their own motivations and their own ways that they got there.
Right. Well, it's just in a couple of books I've read, yours included, as well as the other one I referenced, I have been expecting a little bit to see reference to the late 18th century term of elector, which may have been regarded generically by the founders, but I'm familiar with the College of Cardinals, and they are electors. Of course, that dates back into the Middle Ages. But it's, when we talk about Electoral College, so there you've got the word college. And then you have the College of Cardinals, whose primary responsibility is to elect the new Pope. And there's quite a history to changes in the numbers and types of people in the College of Cardinals. And they may gather occasionally for doctrinal purposes, but primarily they're known as electors. And then the other one in deep history is the Holy Roman Empire, which had 9 electors. And they were specifically called that name. There were, I think, 4 civilians or sovereigns and maybe 3 bishops that were the electors. And it was depending on the state or principality that they came from, how someone became an elector might have been hereditary or appointive in some way by a certain bishop. But to me, those two things, the electors of the Holy Roman Emperor and the College of Cardinals, were the only historical parallels, not even parallels, antecedents to our own Electoral College. Any comment on that?
Unfortunately, I do not have much experience in researching either of those two topics, but I am very interested in what you say. And certainly there has been I can imagine that there have been some individuals who may have made some sort of maybe slightly more religious connection with that. But I'm actually quite interested in looking into that. So
Yeah.
I might be doing some more additional research.
Right. Well, it's, I just wonder where they got the term elector from, the founders,
Yes.
whether it was, and I've seen no one has said anything about that. It's only because of my own
Interesting.
historical interest I'm aware of it. But,
If
maybe
I find out the
elector.
answer, I'll let you know right away.
Right.
I'll start looking into it.
Yeah. Well, Emily, thank you very, very much. This has been such
Thank
an
you.
engrossing conversation, and I really appreciate it.